Hello everyone, and welcome to what is essentially going to be a free masterclass on here. I feel like that's what this is going to be today. So I honestly think that this probably could have been turned into a workshop, but I feel like this is really important information. This is about coping mechanisms, and I'm going to go in a decent amount of depth today, decoding coping mechanisms and weaving in and out of the things I think are really, really important for every single one of us to really have a grasp on in order for us to move beyond lives that are just based in coping and into lives that we don't have to actually cope with. So I have written basically 4 or 5 pages this morning, and I'm going to walk us through this. So it's going to be very succinct. Be present with what I'm saying. And if you have to come back and watch it again, I would say feel free to do that. And please share this video if you get good insight from this. Okay, so coping mechanisms are tools let's start over. Coping mechanisms are tools. Any tool can be used to help or harm. Coping mechanisms exist on a spectrum of harm and help. Whether a coping mechanism is helpful or harmful is dependent upon the mechanism itself, the amount of that mechanism being used, and how harmful or helpful it is in relation to current coping mechanisms that are in place. A coping mechanism is something that creates temporary relief for a problem or trauma that cannot be solved with the current perception, resources, or circumstances. The majority of our coping mechanisms are set up subconsciously in childhood. However, what most people fail to recognize about coping mechanisms is twofold. One, that often the very thing a person is trying to avoid ends up being perpetuated by the coping mechanism. And 2, that you cannot solve a problem with the same mindset, tools, and behavior which created it. Shifting coping mechanisms comes in 2 parts. 1 is awareness and deconstructing of the current pattern, and 2 is the introduction and ownership of a missing or suppressed truth, energy, or behavior with the sole purpose of being in reality and meeting your needs. Coping mechanisms are always about creating an illusion of or partial supply of security, safety, or connection when the being sees no alternative. Coping mechanisms are internal or external soothers, things we alter about ourselves, environment, or others as a way of attempting to change or avoid negative feelings or circumstances. Coping is a form of unconscious manipulation rooted in the core beliefs of low self-worth and powerlessness, which came from feeling unable to meet one's needs directly and consistently throughout life. Not to be mistaken with consciously changing something you dislike or find painful. That is the proper and right use of your free will. Okay, that's very different. For the sake of this video, I'm going to make the statement that there is no such thing as a positive coping mechanism. Of course, some of this is semantics, as positive coping is a spectrum, which is context dependent, which is what I just said before. For example, it is healthier to cope consciously than unconsciously. Before I get into examples of coping mechanisms, I want to give you guys this note. So this is not a black and white subject. We are dealing with entire false identities based around survival, not knowing what is authentic to you, and having to have context-dependent nuance around what we label as good and bad coping mechanisms. The healing process takes place in layers, and there are certain coping mechanisms which fall into gray areas, which we could consider to be positive or negative depending on the context. For example, one person watching TV under a blanket to avoid responsibility could be getting so out of hand that all other aspects of their life become unmanageable. For another person, watching TV under a blanket to avoid overstimulation could be a fantastic way to regulate themselves as they work to crank themselves down from fight or flight. And be very careful here to not allow your ego to trick you into believing that you're in the second example, which is, I'm really just using this and it's really helpful. It's a bridge when you're really the first person. Okay. I think about things like crack or like, there's just certain things that it's like, okay, let's not convince ourselves we are where we are truly not. Let's not lie to ourselves. For one person, the activity, so this is going back to the example that I just gave. For one person, the activity is enabling their current coping mechanism, which is total avoidance. For the second person, this is actually an intervention against the impulse to continually overstimulate with work projects. In either scenario, we still have to resolve the deeper disharmonic emotional, physiological, psychological, and spiritual patterns. So you see, this isn't about saying you can never cope with life. It's to understand what it is to cope and to orient ourselves towards building a life that we don't have to cope with. To cope implies that there is no deeper change able to be made, and so we must endure some level of pain. Of course, the mechanism itself was designed to save our lives, and so in that sense, the intention is quite pure. However, coping is not the same thing as healing. To heal is to successfully and consciously employ strategies which shift the overall awareness, harmony, and strength of our being and system. So, ways that we might cope. We will alter our personality traits. If being quiet and compliant got me love, I will identify with these qualities as a way of coping with my fear of abandonment or rejection. And the same goes for any quality which was favored by the social group raising you that you learned to adopt as a way of surviving. Being funny or self-deprecating, being self-serving in an environment where you learned everyone was out for themselves, being emotionally guarded when you learned emotions would make you a target, being hyper-responsible to avoid feeling out of control or not good enough, perfectionism to avoid feelings of self-hate, chameleoning to avoid abandonment and rejection, not engaging in life or laying around to avoid feeling like a failure. Other coping mechanisms include consciousness and mood-altering substances, drugs, alcohol, exercise, watching TV, meditation, your spiritual practice, scrolling on social media, and the list could quite literally go on and on and on. One thing that all coping mechanisms have in common is this. This is really important. The coping mechanism always ends up creating the very thing it was designed to keep away, which is pain. Sometimes this pain is the exact same pain the coping mechanism was created to avoid. And other times, it's a new vulnerability which emerges from the suppression of certain aspects of self. My nose is so itchy. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 examples. Number 1, Patrice is terrified of being rejected. Her parents only liked her when she was compliant and quiet. When she gets into conflicts with other adults or customers at her job that have a more dominating energy than her, she caves and feels small. She goes against her boundaries and accommodates for others when she actually doesn't want to or have the energy to. Patrice has subconsciously decided it is better to lose herself than it is to lose a customer at work or make someone upset. That feeling was so intense for her as a child that she does everything, including rejecting herself, to avoid that feeling. Patrice is doing to herself the very thing she hopes to avoid from others. And yet she also ends up feeling very disconnected, to other people because of this process. So what is Patrice to do? First, she must recognize the impulse to please and subdue herself for external safety with her social group. She must recognize the harm she is doing to herself by going against her own needs and truth. That must be more uncomfortable for her than her desire to fit in or keep the peace. Now the hard part. Patrice is going to have to walk through the fire of terror she has when speaking her boundaries. Her whole body may be shaking, but she holds her inner child who is afraid of being attacked or rejected. She will have to hold firm in her knowing that no one is going to protect her energy but herself, and she must want to be true to herself no matter what. She is now more committed to being authentic and real with others than she is to living in a false sense of security. She realizes she never had connection with the people she made herself small around. They only loved her for what she did for them. She is angry that she let people walk all over her for so long and decides she isn't doing anyone any favors by allowing them to continue to play out their own manipulative behavior on her. The cycle ends with Patrice, as hard as it is. It's the kind of world she wants to live in. So Patrice takes a stand with her life and how she carries herself and her energy. The second example is like a little bit less specific, but it's still pretty specific. Hansen is a pretty emotionally walled off person. His father wasn't around much and never paid him any attention when he cried. His older brothers would beat on him for being the youngest and would call him names like sissy boy. He couldn't ever fully turn off his sensitivity, but he found a way to make it look like he did. As an adult, Hansen gets into fights. He is completely identified with being the tough guy. He became so good at inhabiting the identity he created that even he believed it. He is angry and finds it hard to connect with other men. He always feels like he is competing with them and turned to partying early on to numb the feelings that he tried to keep so hard at bay. Hansen has subconsciously decided it is better for him to silence his sensitivity than lose the connection of his brothers and father. This fear of loss that really mattered as a child, as a matter of life and death, has now become generalized and is completely controlling his life and self-concept. He is depressed, struggles with anxiety, never feels like he belongs, and hasn't been able to cry in years. Hansen's life will have to completely fall apart before he is able to recognize the pain he felt back then created an entire lifetime of inauthentic choices and identities. He is terrified of showing emotion or vulnerability, but also feels incredibly alone. The very thing that kept him connected all these decades left his sense of self in 1,000 pieces. He meets a man who seems to be more in touch with his feelings, and for the first time, he doesn't reject this man. He shares a little bit of himself. Scared of what will happen if he does, but unwilling to continue to live a lie, he decides it's worth the risk. So for most of us, we are not going to change until the moment that the coping mechanism has left us literally with the same vulnerability we were trying to get rid of, or created a new vulnerability, because either way we're not addressing the deeper needs, and that deeper need is literally going to be busting at the seams. And it's usually in that moment where it's no longer worth it to continue to uphold that mechanism that we jump, that we hold that fear, and we do the thing that we've never done before that's hard, hoping and praying that by aligning with our truth, that will somehow mean something for the way that our life organizes itself, that we'll be held in that process. This is just a little note here at the end to go back to some of the caveats that I was making. Well, I think I actually pretty much already touched on this. So basically I'm saying don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to coping mechanisms. It's better to consciously cope with something than to unconsciously cope with something. People that don't even think about these things and are in denial about what they're suppressing, they're in a worse off position, or we'll say they're in a more unconscious position than somebody who is actively aware of the emotional patterns or things that are trying to come up, and also actively aware of choosing to suppress that. That's like the second stage there, is that awareness piece. So it's better to consciously cope than unconsciously, and that's often the first step to changing ingrained behavior. We realize what we are doing and how it is or has been serving us up to this point. We examine what need this is filling. What pain is this attempting to keep me out of? Is it working? How well is it working? What are the negative consequences I risk by continuing this coping mechanism? What needs don't get met by continuing this coping mechanism? You see, any tool can be used as a coping mechanism to avoid pain or suppress aspects of our personal truth. That's what I was talking about earlier. And any tool can be used to bring balance and harmony to a system depending on what it needs. So the key is to examine what the actual need is and how best to go about getting that need met as directly as possible. Because as I said in the beginning, that belief and that reality as a child that you couldn't get that need met directly is the very thing that creates the coping mechanism. So we're moving into a state of empowerment by shifting into something that's actually going to meet the need, instead of continue to, like I've said multiple times throughout this video, create the very conditions and continue to create the very reality in the body and in the life that is a perfect mirror of the wound. Now, if you think about it from a mirroring perspective, or from a law of attraction perspective, from a perspective of us being put in touch with what it is that we are supposed to heal about ourselves, that's actually fucking genius. Because what it means is, even when we try to cope our way out of that pain, there is literally a fail-safe in place that goes, eventually, like, this is only going to get you so far. This is only going to get you to a place where you're probably an adult, and now you have, you're not just at the mercy of your keepers, so to speak. So it's only going to get you so far, and then you're going to be led back to the exact core that created that, because oftentimes, like I said, you're either going to become aware of that core need that didn't get met through the coping mechanism making you feel exactly how you felt in the first place, which is wild that it works that way, or it caused you to polarize, and you're still going to have to become aware of that suppressed energy. So it's like this fail-safe where we will bust at the seams eventually, and then we will just choose something different. But that's a process. It's a layered process. So that was all, guys. I feel like there were some, I don't know, I know there's other of you that have talked about this on videos, like, the longer you start off like this and the longer that the video goes, by the end of it I'm like this. Jesus. I hope that was helpful. Probably watch it again. There's lots of little juicy nuggies in there, and please share this with people so that we're aware of this stuff, that this exists. And sometimes we need that mental piece for something to click in. I had to write this because of how relevant this is to all of the work that I do one-on-one with people. And this is really, this writing here is a byproduct of putting together all those pieces in all those sessions, and also just my own experiences. And sometimes it's that like click that piece of information that goes, oh, like I hadn't tried it on that way before. I hadn't thought about this piece of it. And sometimes that's enough to actually click us over into the next layer of our development. So be well, have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend, and I will see you guys another time.